I'd like to do is just to get us started is if each person can please introduce themselves, and then we can pick up whatever you'd like to speak about. But I think this is a good starting point, what Scott, what you focused on, so we can begin there. But perhaps Scott, you can briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. My name's Scott. I work in marketing by day, and by night I run a website and project called Remember Your Light. And the website's rylhealing.com, where I look at some of these concepts related to expanding our view of science and combining that with spirituality and with a strong foundation in light and some light therapies that I found very helpful within my life. Yeah, that's what I do.
Cool. Thank you. Dolan?
Hi, I'm Dolan and I am from Calgary, Canada. So, what brought interest in me about your work is that concept of light, like how you integrated something so scientific with the part of spirituality and bringing in different dimensions, and how you're bringing in the concepts of diversity, time, space, then different things in the cells and different aspects, like all the things that we see in the universe, how you are relating it with the light. So it's for me an integration of science and spirituality, and my background being scientific and also with a deep interest in spirituality, like this really interested me.
Thank you, Dolan. Cameron, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Uh, Cameron. I'm calling in from California right now, and I'm fascinated by the esoteric side of life, and it's the main thing that I like to learn more about. So, in work, I use some models of human sort of psychology connected with models of how the universe works to help people find their talents. And so I'm always wanting to understand from a different viewpoint how things work.
Cool. Thank you. Right, awesome. So I think that what I intend for this call is that for people to organically bring up whatever they would like to as a concluding call, and perhaps we can start with this musing that Scott had brought up, number 33. And Scott, would you like to just uh, summarize your thoughts that you had shared earlier for the benefit of everyone, and perhaps we can just have a discussion around that first.
Yeah, so part of this musing really stood out to me because there are so many connections to this and a lot of other things that have been popping up in my life. There's kind of this serendipity, at least at the moment, with what I saw here, and some other things that I've read, and some other things that I'm looking into and researching right now. This human connection to light and the ultimate nature of light as the kind of driving force behind all of creation. So there are some parts in here that talk about when a human becomes aware of their emergence from the single light-based edifice, when a human can freely enter the logic of micro and macro space-time energy gravity containers, when a human realizes that they are one with the light and can freely move, be, and act as light, then it may be said that the human has been endowed with the computational power that thus far had been the province of the cosmos only. And so I was just mentioning that there are some correlates to this. There's a couple. I just mentioned Walter Russell earlier, who I think in the 1920s wrote a book called The Secret of Light. And in the beginning, before the book starts, he quotes the Divine Iliad, an even older piece. And I'll just read a little bit of that quickly. It started off, I am the light, I alone am. So it's kind of from the perspective of that ultimate nature. What I am, thou art the light, thou art one with me. So now it's the universe talking to a human, presumably, and talking about how there is that connectedness or this singularity that is talked about in this musing. Man may know me by desiring to know me. To know me is to be me. Through my light alone can man know me. Man is light when he knoweth that he is light. And it just connected so well to this musing here. And there's in Walter Russell's The Universal One, and he talks a lot about this concept of light being the source of everything. And he also talks about man must think in light. His thinking must be in terms of the electromagnetic periodicities which measure all motion, for of such is he himself and nothing else. To know how to think in light from within is to open the doors of all knowledge. Omnipotence lies in perfect thinking. There is no power in this universe other than the energy of the thinking mind. And matter is light. Nothing is which is not light. I know the wording is a little kind of esoteric there, but there's a lot of connections. And in I had mentioned this to Pravir at some point too. In The Secret of Light, Walter Russell actually mentions omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and then what he calls a oneness of the self soul with the universal self soul, which are the fourfold properties of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony that comes about in the cosmology of light here too. So there's so much connection and this connection to light and this deeper nature and this fourfoldness and how we as humans are connected to this power in the light. And then there's this concept that when we come to this realization and connect with this light and connect with our nature as the light, that we gain some kind of power over the universe that we experience. And I won't go too into this yet, I'll let some other people share, but there's this concept that I've been reading about that was suggested by a group called the Life Physics Group out of California, who did most of their work between 10 and 15 years ago, I think. And they have this concept called light encoded reality matrix, where they proposed a mechanism, and it gets kind of complicated. They try to really create a new physics, a new life physics. And they talk about these terms like sonobioelectrogravitics and biogeosystemics, and trying to actually look at the physical mechanisms for how we are connected to these deeper levels of the universe. But they basically talk about how unconsciously all the time there's a deeper part of us that is essentially light encoding our reality. That's light encoded reality matrix, that we are actually creating and co-creating our reality in light, and sharing that in the quantum world, in quantum manifestation, sharing that light encoded reality together, but that there's a deeper connected part of us that is actually doing that creation at all times. And there are ways that we can learn how to tap into that to actually, this would be like a real manifestation. And there are stories of monks mastering this ability to light encode an actual object in front of them by connecting to this oneness and their kind of singularity with the light of the and this power that we thought was only for the cosmos that you mentioned in this musing here. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts when I saw this.
Well, that's fascinating. It's amazing to find out what's already been done or what other people have worked on independently. And I think Walter Russell, you mentioned, was as many as maybe what, 1930s, you said?
He started writing his books in the 1920s, I think,
1920s. Wow. So
or
that's like
maybe even earlier. But yeah,
yeah, yeah, that's awesome. So I need to get a book of his. And the other group you mentioned was light physics or light physics?
life
Light,
physics.
light physics. Okay. Yeah, but again, the idea that you can actually encode reality with consciously with some light manipulation that can originate from you. That's also pretty fascinating, and that's somewhat consistent with this. But of course, it's not suggesting that in here in the cosmology of light that that's an easy process to do. But it's a possible process. Yes. Yeah.
I was thinking that even at this level where a human becomes one with the light and is experiencing it at its maximum dimension, or maybe at its maximum speed, when one is one with that, there is kind of a duality, probably to say, or maybe like more like triple or quadruple,
Mhm.
like where apart, where the consciousness inside or the awareness inside can be aware of this oneness and realize that, but still at the material level, at the very physical level, where we have to do things practically, where we have to go from one place to another practically or do things practically, I think then one would be experiencing light in very dual levels, like in the part of the consciousness where one is experiencing it at its maximum speed and its maximum dimension, whereas in the physical level where there is so much limitation, probably then one would be experiencing light at its very low velocity, because things become so hard and material and slow in the process of the physical matter.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that it's non-trivial to be able to experience these realities simultaneously, or to, for example, living in the material realm, to have access to this other dimension of light, and as though it were part of this dimension of light. I think I mean, theoretically, it seems like it's possible if one takes this model where everything is containered or exists within this, if you will, this volume or sphere of light that travels infinitely fast. So it's always present. It always exists with all its power. And then everything else down to the materialization that we are aware of, and the way we materialize is happening within this larger container, if you will. So that's contextual. But the question is, how do you make that operative moment to moment? So in a sense, how do you let infinity act in the finiteness that one is strapped into practically? It seems like it's possible, but non-trivial. So I think
So I don't get that part. Like, is it possible? Like, as you mentioned about different bodies, like even in the spiritual thing, there is like a subtle body, then subtle auras and all that. So probably we could experience some of that in those dimensions. But I'm just wondering, like at the level of matter, can things move so fast? Because if it moves so fast, then our body would be like more as a piece of an energy rather than having real hands and feet and having to eat or having to go somewhere. So probably theoretically it is possible, but that's what I'm thinking. Like probably in this dimension, I don't know if we can really bring that aspect of light and realize that subtlety or that awareness or that lightness in the heaviness of the material body. We could probably experience in other parts of our body, in other realms, in different dimensions, like subtle bodies or auras, or like we have different energetic fields and energetic bodies, so we could probably experience those in that levels. But I'm also thinking about matter. Like if things happen in matter, it would be really so much beautiful, because then it would cure us of so much limitations and suffering that we face every day.
yeah, that's a really good point. And the question for me is, what really is matter? So we've come to, we have kind of a bias on how we perceive and experience matter. But the question is, is that the only way that matter can be experienced? And is that the only experience of matter that's possible? So those are open questions. I don't know, but I'm just saying
So
that.
what would be your perspective on matter? Like, as you were mentioning that it
Yeah.
differs on different perspective, like from the regular daily life or the something like how do you experience it differentially, if you can share?
And not so I don't experience it any differently than I think anybody else, but just conceptually, it seems to me that matter is a lot more flexible than perhaps we can we imagine it to be. So there's kind of a habituation. There's a way in which we have evolved through millennia that predispose us to act with matter, in matter, in a certain way. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way to act in matter. I'm just speaking conceptually, that matter, when I think about it conceptually, it could have or allow the entries from these other realms, if you will, or other speeds of light that create different kinds of material realities to coexist in it, if we became open to that possibility, and not just conceptually, but if somehow we're able to consciously enter into what matter is, and then allow something different to happen in it. It seems like it could become a different basis, but again, this is conceptual ideas. So,
But Bohm, who we've mentioned before, and others thought of matter just as a particular condensation of light, sort of oscillating at speeds slower than light would normally travel. So there are many thoughts where matter is just sort of a particular condensation of light. And one of something else that you said reminded me. Oh, so this kind of distinction is really indicative of the journey that I've been on, where in health, for instance, in the Western world especially, we have a very material, matter-based perception of the human body and health and illness. And I, maybe a year and a half ago or so, started to open my mind to the idea of more energy-based health, energy medicine modalities. Some of them have been around for thousands of years, and this is kind of a representation of that dichotomy where we can focus so much on matter and live within matter and think in matter. But I've personally found so much more depth and success by thinking about myself and my own health more in terms of energy, sort of at a level beneath that. So that distinction you were talking about reminded me of that's been so instrumental in my journey.
yeah, thank you.
It also reminds me of that Musing 24, where you are talking about light creating this nucleic acid, polysaccharide, lipid, protein, and the light has to manifest at different dimensions in order to create these cell structures, and even for us to function like in our normal physical body. I know, like at the energetic level, we can change some aspects of things, but I'm also thinking like if there is a different way of materialization, or if suddenly things change, like suddenly, then there can be so much chaos that can come about in the structure of the cells and even in our bodies, and the way our bodies function, the ways our cell functions, because there is some infinite intelligence behind how these DNAs get multiplied and these polysaccharides that will be like everything is so well orchestrated within the cell, like from a biological point of view. So even one slight change, like as we know, even one slight mutation in the DNA can cause so much havoc, or if the cells start multiplying over, then people get cancer. So like even one slight change can cause so much disturbance in our entire material frame. And then if the material frame is shaken, it becomes so hard for us to even experience things energetically, because the health is the first thing. So
Yeah. 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 I actually, so I wrote a book called The Origins and Possibilities of Genetics, where precisely what you just brought up, I try and go into that in more detail, just from I would say from a mathematical point of view, to say, okay, how do you maintain that stability? Or obviously there's a bias to maintain whatever has been created through this sophisticated intelligence. And then what does mutation mean in that context? So at least the way I was thinking about it is that there's a, a, a few different kinds of mutation, depending on the level of light that one were to connect to, in a sense. So if you were able to connect to some layer of light that travel faster than c, 186,000 miles per second, where there's more compact, more elaborate, comprehensive information, that in a sense has kind of like the prototypes, or it has the meta function of what the possibilities are with polysaccharides or lipids or proteins. And they would need to manifest in a certain way to maintain the integrity of what they stand for. So if one were to able to connect with that layer, then mutation would occur in a way which would not disrupt any of the positivity. I mean, just theoretically speaking. However, a different kind of mutation is where one entered into, say, light, assuming that light travels slower than 186,000 miles per second as well. So, we've taken an extreme case where light projects itself at zero speed, and in a cosmology of light, that's where you have the absence of knowledge, or the absence of presence of power or harmony. So it's a completely different influence on what's happening at the material level. And so it's always a quote unquote dark influence that exists in our material life. And if mutation hooks into that process where light is existing in a subfield, if you will, then it's going to be like destructive mutation as opposed to constructive mutation. So I think the way to, at least the way that I see mutation, is that if, depending on the layer of inspiration, mutation would take on a different meaning. Anyway, that's what I've explored in some depth in that writing of Origins and Possibilities of Genetics. And I try and work it out mathematically to say, okay, what would it mean? What it's non-trivial to be able to penetrate the barrier where you're entering into an antecedent layer of light that's traveling faster, and it requires a purity of consciousness, if you will, or a purity in oneself to be able to make that ascension and integrate what's there with this thing that we experience as matter over here. And so there's certain kind of inherent barriers that exist that wouldn't allow a kind of like a deceptive or a devilish or a destructive influence to mutate things from that point of view. So if mutation were to occur in a destructive way, then at least the way that I modeled it out is that it couldn't affect the kind of integrative layer that's at a faster speed of light, at a kind of faster layer of light. but it could only affect locally what one was subject to. So just within one's own frame. Anyway, that's how I kind of like address this issue that you bring up.
So
And
on this,
point, yeah.
okay, sorry, did you want to finish?
No, I was just saying, and it's just a point of view. That's
so
all.
just on the same relation, like if you have more insights on the kind of on the pandemic that we are facing, because just when everything was on a rise and things seemed to come to a bit of settlement and people were pretty like the vaccines came out and people are getting vaccinated now, there are more deadly strains of the virus that's coming, and this is all because of the mutation. So on a surface level, like it might look like these mutations are destructive because they are really causing a lot of havoc in the entire world. But like to me, like sometimes I wonder, like, is all this destruction all for nothing? Like all this price that the earth is paying, the human beings are paying to this sudden pandemic. Like obviously there must be a background of energy that might have brought about this, but all this, it's kind of a payment back to the nature. Like all this payment that we are paying through our suffering and through the, like there people have different connotations, like so much good has come about through the pandemic, so many, but still so many lives are lost, and all this payment that's happening and the mutations that are happening so fast, it seems to cause so much destruction on the outside level. But isn't there some evolution that is taking place, some intelligence behind this? So it's like as though, like to me, like sometimes, like at least for a hope, like instead of getting, like I would like to think like there are probably two aspects that is working. One is something light that is probably occurring, some evolution or some change in the pattern of thinking of the humans.
Yeah.
So there is probably a light that is occurring, but in order for that light to manifest, it is taking the form of a darkness or the mutation. And sometimes we, even like so many spiritual people are working on this, this energetically. So many people are meditating and praying throughout the world, but things doesn't seem to change. So like only way to have hope or feeling that this might lead to something good is probably something greater is coming through this seeming darkness of light or through this seeming fragmentation. So any insights on that? Because I would like to think of the mutation that's happening like on that. So it's probably some dual aspect, like as though the light is kind of dividing itself, one as a manifestation of energy of darkness and one as a manifestation of energy of evolution that we can't see or something like that.
Yeah, I can offer my thoughts, but then I'd also want to hear from others, their point of view. So Scott, Cameron, I would love to hear from you on this as well. But one thought that occurs to me about this, or some points of view, is that, one is that light, since we, in a cosmology of light in this model, everything that happens in light, as it were, and all the possibilities that materialize. Light is always working, in a sense, to expand its own possibilities, and that's what evolution, to me, is. Now, it's not necessary that darkness arise in order for light to materialize itself, but regardless of whether there's darkness or light is going to materialize. Now, so what I'm saying is that darkness is optional, and there's, perhaps there's a reason that it seems to be a dark phase now, which is something different. But light always, the way I see it, light always wants to progress more of light materially, and that's what it's always working towards. It'll work through darkness, it'll work through whatever's happening to kind of create that potentiality more and more, whatever exists within it in its infinite potential. That's always going to happen. The darkness, could have various reasons for it, and it's a persistent influence. If we think about cosmology of light having projected itself at zero speed, which is the origin of darkness in this model, there's always going to be an influence of darkness, and in a sense, light battles with darkness, but light always kind of emerges. Now, one can karmically look at, okay, how did this pandemic COVID-19 arise? And certainly one point of view is that it arose because of humans' action to destroy ecosystems that existed with their fullness of life. And then there were leaps of conditions that existed in certain species that were compromised, and the barrier was crossed so that those viruses and conditions that existed in those species crossed into human beings that wouldn't have happened if those ecosystems were functioning the way that they were. And so, in some sense, this was a natural outcome of our own action, if you will, but that doesn't mean it was necessary. We could still have created whatever is going to be created through the negative action of the pandemic without the pandemic. But the pandemic now forces a certain thing to become more strong to oppose it. And that also is an action of light. But anyway, I want to just get Scott and Cameron's thought on this as well. So
I like what you said at the end there, how these manifestations come about in a way to make us stronger, so that we are learning, so that we are growing and expanding. In a way, the way that there's a perspective where you can look at what a virus is and what it represents as a form of biological information. And there are studies that look at actually positive influences of viruses on the human body, where they and a lot of this makes a lot more sense on the energetic level too, but even on the physical, even on the sort of the material level, the biological information can upgrade our bodies in a way to deal with new environmental factors, to be more resilient. Can also help us to clear out toxins and things that we're exposed to from the environment, and become mechanisms in our body for that kind of cleansing process to take place. So there is certainly a positive perspective that, and I just think sort of this, the story of Noah from the Bible, where we could look at that story where God floods the world as and of just from the perspective of a story, you could look at that as a negative, as darkness, that that we're wiping out the population. But it was a necessary part of the story, and it led to more beauty and growth and more more light within the human species as they went through that trial, in a sense. That these can be tough perspectives to have, but that's sort of one way to look at it. If we're also looking in, when Dolan, when you were talking about these new variants and mutations that are popping up, and your gut was to label them as, or to on the surface see them as negative mutations, where maybe they are arising because of a lack of connection to our deeper source in light. And you had mentioned the vaccine. If we are thinking about how this connection to light creates positive mutations, if we're relying on a material solution for this, what can be considered this sort of energetic outcome and manifestation that we've all experienced, if we're applying a material solution to that and not seeking the solution in light, that may serve to cause those mutations in a way that is not seemingly positive for us. So those are just some of the thoughts that I had around.
Thank you, Scott. Cameron, any thoughts, anything?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as usual, there's quite a bit because there's so many rich topics in the mix right now. So my thinking on the pandemic and the more broad patterns that it seems to be a part of is basically this. From many different sources, there have been predictions that there are going to be significant alterations to the way the world works around this time period. There's Bible prophecy, Mayan calendar, Terence McKenna's time wave 0, extraterrestrial channelings. The specific dates are different, but it's all right around this roughly 30-year window. So one of the information sources I've gotten a lot of value from is human design. I think I might have mentioned last time. And not exactly the pandemic, but the specific timing of a massive transition was predicted back in the 80s. And what was communicated was that the focal point of the transition is 2027. And then there would be about 10 years of adjustment prior to that and after that. And that a number of different things are happening with 2027 as the focal point. One of them is that the, you could say the sort of base layer operating system that our human consciousness is operating within or on top of, the rules are going to change a bit. We're moving from an era focused on essentially, you could say, truth determined through collective experience overlap, right? We're determining truth in a collective way through the scientific method. We're coming up with elaborate rules and agreements that we all follow so that a factory can function and all these other complex social structures can function. And that's been in operation the last 400-ish years, and that's what's going away as of 2027. So what we're seeing is the breakdown of shared reality, right? There are no singular news sources that everyone pays attention to get their programming. They follow whatever collection of information sources they're resonating to. So there isn't anything anymore to establish collective reality among the whole species. Not that it was ever, across the entire species, but, there used to be like 3 news channels that everyone watched. So we were all on the same page. So the specific ways that this is happening is, of course, a surprise, but this is pretty much exactly what the human design prediction indicated would happen. What we're moving into is a sort of base layer consciousness programming operating system that's focused more on individual experience. And so what is predicted and seems to be happening is that the breakdown of large institutional structures that depend upon elaborate agreements between people based on this shared reality, it's not going to be possible to sustain anymore. So we're seeing the breakdown, and it's a transition to something different, which could be better or really depends on how we handle the transition. Along with that, you brought up the idea of mutation, and one of the other major things that was predicted by human design is that our species would mutate. Beginning roughly in 2027 is probably when they say we'll see the first births. And there's some predictions about the nature of the new variant of the human species. And the idea is that the consciousness is not as much located within the individual. It's more located within small groups. So the new species is conscious of kind of a collective group entity.
Cool.
See what happens, right?
Yeah,
but,
yeah. I mean that's certainly bring up some really interesting points. Before we kind of follow up on that, human dynamics. So can you say a little bit more about that? Haven't been exposed to that before. Just say a little more about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, and happy to share a bit more in depth, in a different conversation if you like. But basically, this is one of the most elegant frameworks for understanding humans that I've ever encountered. It synthesizes Kabbalah, the I Ching, the chakra system, and a few other knowledge sources with some elements of quantum mechanics. And what gets generated is a map of essentially your individual imprint. And the way that's interpreted specifically is the way that your consciousness, they refer to it as a crystal. It's not literally, but it's referred that way, reflects, shapes the stream of universal consciousness that flows through you.
Okay.
That's interpreted very, very similar to what you're describing with light, except they believe that it's actually carried by the neutrino stream. So not visible to our eyes, but otherwise very similar idea. So you get a map of your imprint and what works for you. And then there are other structures that were also described. The new auric entity that gets created by a group of humans on a small scale, and then the yet again different structure that comes into being when you have a large group of people and how that dynamic works together. So there's a lot of info in that rabbit hole, but that's a brief overview.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. It's fascinating to me how many things I've not heard of that have been around for a while, and there's so it's nice to hear. Scott's brought up a few different things today, and this model of human dynamics as well sounds very interesting. Would Dolan or Scott like to kind of respond, or does it bring up any thoughts for you when you hear that? And then coming back to your question, Dolan, is there anything else that you wanted to add based on the conversation?
I'm still trying to grasp like everything that has been spoken and thinking around that. So
Yeah, that was a lot of really intense information.
Scott, any reactions for you?
It's interesting. I've seen human design come up in some of the circles that I've encountered. I haven't researched it specifically, but there's a lot of overlap between some other frameworks and models that I've encountered and that have been helpful in piecing together information in a more complete way than in ways that are done in the past. The thing about the timelines too, I found very interesting. I think I came across something called Project Looking Glass, and it's probably one of those conspiracy theories where the there was some technology of looking into the future, and it kind of stopped. They like were unable to look past a certain point in time around this time period that you're talking about. And there's this other framework that I'm familiar with that talks about during this time as well, how we're shifting from an external creation sort of ascension pathway. And Pravir, you had mentioned that concept of ascension earlier, and you can find it kind of in Walter Russell's work, where he talks about when you finally found the light, the play is over, and that's sort of his concept of ascension, and or like the singularity too, that we're moving from this external creation to internal creation, where everything sort of gets created through the individual and our own connection to light or source or something else. So yeah, there were some interesting correlates there to some things that I have looked into.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to mention we're just a few minutes from the hour here, and I wanted to mention that my intention with we've had probably like I think 6 or 7 conversations to do with the musings, and I wanted to bring that series to an end. However, what I want to do going forward is just have a more focused discussion around particular topics. So what I might propose is, for instance, one of the musings from a cosmology of light to be kind of the anchor, but any kind of point of view related to that could be brought up, and we can just have a more comprehensive discussion, and then connect it to the bigger framework of the cosmology of light in some way. And I would try and do that. But so what I'm saying is that going forward, I'm going to propose some topics maybe once a month, so that maybe the last Friday of a month, and whoever's interested can participate in that, and we can just have a 1-hour dialogue, people bringing their own points of view as it relates to that topic. But that's how I see this going forward, just from here on. So.
If we still have a little time, there was one thing I wanted to bring up earlier related to light and how we are able to tap into different experiences of light and sort of be light. The life physics group, they had started with the concept of remote viewing, sort of being able to project one's consciousness in various degrees to a remote location and bring back information from there. And they did some research using, I don't know actually how extensive their use of sensors became, but Kirlian and there's Kirlian photography, and I'm losing it. It's there's another imaging modality to look at what essentially you could consider auras, or sort of light or magnetic fields radiating from the human body. And they sort of determined or proposed that these remote viewing experiences or consciousness projections were able to happen through a Meisner effect, or a Meisner field would be created extending outward from the body. And then on top of that, it would create, when you entered a certain state, and they used biofeedback to try to get into these states, there was what they called an anti-Meisner field, which was really just resonant layers of electromagnetic fields emanating from the body. And they were able to basically send that light out to receive distant information. And they practiced this technique, and were able to send their consciousness to far reaches of the universe, and not even necessarily our physical universe that we know of, but sort of a broader concept of the universe that they called the unum. And they have brought up concepts of the plenum too, like you mentioned, Cameron. But this multi-layered concept of the universe, where they were able to connect their consciousness through this light projection modality to experience deeper levels of reality. And that was sort of an interesting physical explanation of some of the stuff that we've been talking about in, connecting with these different levels of light and our reality through our consciousness.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, anybody else would like to say anything before we conclude?
Scott, would you be able to explain a bit more on the chat that you sent, that electroacoustic resonant where DNA is actually, like, would you be able to explain more on that? Like,
So
something, or did you explain?
he was a Russian researcher, so a lot of the research is in Russian. But he had Peter Garriev had this concept of linguistic wave genetics, where he did all these, he did various tests using DNA, and he was able to sort of use light emanations from the DNA to encode the information from the DNA onto things like water, or even kind of record, I think, acoustically in some way, the emanations from the DNA to get at the information that the DNA held. So DNA became this kind of electroacoustic, almost like instrument, if you will, that carried information in a more complex and cohesive way, rather than just within its base pairs.
It could transfer information to different mediums like water and maybe other.
Yeah, so he was able to use some kind of laser technology to transfer the information from DNA onto water, where then they were able to test the water using PCR, and get a positive result for the original genetic information.
So whatever information he wanted to manifest, so he manifested that in water, like from the DNA. Suppose he wanted to manifest a particular trait, suppose a red color or something, he could manifest that in water or something like that.
He was able to test positive for the sequencing, so it carried the information of the chemical structure. I think that's how it was. But yeah, you can research him. It's hard to find a ton of information on it because a lot of it's in Russian, but it's some interesting stuff.
Yeah, so that gives me a thought that perhaps what I'll do is, in the next conversation that I'll propose, we could focus around genetics, for instance, because I have a few musings on genetics, and just very briefly, my point of view, which is somewhat resonant with what you just brought up, Scott, is that I use kind of, or in the cosmology of light, the way I see it is that space-time energy gravity becomes, in a sense, the language in which code expresses itself. And that those space-time energy gravity logic that exists, that creates micro law, can manifest in different materials, but then also with the emergence of the cell, it manifests in DNA. It kind of materializes, or it gets encased in DNA, but it also exists prior. So for example, if you were to consider like the electromagnetic field, or if you were to consider quantum particles or atoms, things that we normally say don't have anything genetic about them, but what I propose in Origin and Possibilities of Genetics is that in fact there's a quote unquote genetic structure or imprint that exists with anything that materializes, and that creates, in a sense, the set of possibilities that thing that's materialized can be subject to. but it's similar to how we kind of think of genetics and DNA that materializes at the cellular level, except it doesn't require that kind of embodiment to happen. Anyway, but that's just the ending point of our discussion here. Gives me the idea that probably 3 to 4 weeks from now, that's what I'll propose as kind of like a follow-up discussion, and I'll send out an invite to those who might be interested. But anyway, do think about it. And again, it's really been a pleasure to have you all on this call, and such rich contributions, and I think organic contributions. It's been very fulfilling for me over the last few months, and look forward to just how this evolves going forward. But thank you all for participating.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for putting this together. It was
Right.
special.
See you.